Here we go. Okay, so Galen, welcome. Galen is an archaeologist and philologist working in Washington State, and he's received an MA in anthropology, has a graduate diploma, in Germanic philology, and is finishing an MA in medieval language and literature. He's interested in prosody and metrics, Rama studies, and late medieval Icelandic literature. Today, Gael will be delivering the talk, "The Poetry of Magic: Poetic Techniques in the Jarðskinna Manuscript." Okay, it's all yours.
Thank you. Let's see. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, to begin, thank to the organizers for inviting me to speak. As was said in the introduction, my kind of personal research is primarily interested in metrics and prosody. And so today I'm going to be talking about the Jarðskinna spells that we heard earlier today, but from a metrical point of view. How do these function as poetry, or if indeed they can be categorized as such? Um, so the medieval England and Scandinavia through the early modern period boasts a impressive corpus of charms, curses, blessings, prayers. The Old English, in particular, metrical charms, offer a unique insight into pre-Christian belief and practice, as well as very unusual verse structures, which suggest a thriving oral culture, somewhat separate from what we consider classical Old English verse. In a similar way, late medieval Scandinavian rune finds and medieval amulets provide a glimpse of Scandinavian charms, which also seem to blend pre-Christian and Christian magic, as well as the survival of what could be considered some more Eddic style poetry through a runic medium. As we've heard earlier today, there's been a renewed interest in Icelandic grimoires, or collections of spells and magical lore. We typically find these from the 16th and 17th centuries. Recently published, the Jarðskinna manuscript, AM 434D duodecimo, is a small but important witness to this grimoire culture, and several spells, including some for healing and conjuration. This presentation will focus on three such spells for their poetic techniques. We'll compare them to grimoire, such as the Galdur as well as spells from medieval rune sticks, and the Old English metrical charms. Overall, this presentation is going to show that the Jarðskinna spells share certain qualities with these cognate traditions, but they're notable as a kind of free verse, which is highly literate and individualistic. Ultimately, the Jarðskinna and wider Icelandic grimoire tradition shows a departure from previous traditions which blend both folk and continental magic. So, in order to kind of set the stage and illustrate the metrical and poetic features of spells and charms, I'm going to start briefly by going over the Old English metrical charms. These are a good test case for how meter and poetic style function in a magical context, and provide a good um, tradition against which to compare later grimoire spells. Of the Old English literary corpus, there are several texts for ritual incantation, spells, and magical acts. Of these, though, there are 12 so-called metrical charms, so-called as they broadly follow Old English poetic meter. These metrical charms provide protection for a good journey, against a swarm of bees, poor agricultural land, against certain diseases. Most previous metrical research into these charms, though, has observed that while they follow general Germanic alliterative verse patterns, there's a great deal of flexibility and some outright violations of traditional metrics. Recent work by Carolyn Batten shows that the metrical charms seem to focus on certain aesthetic qualities, such as cross alliteration, extra alliteration, rhyme, assonance, anaphora, over strict metrical coherence. Um, so these magical formulae must work as quote unquote magic, more than strict Old English poetry. Um, Citing work by Jonathan Roper, Batten states that the charm must use the right formula, the quote-unquote correct prescribed words, to distinguish itself from everyday non-magical speech and maintain the legitimacy of the speech act. Charms and magical spells must accommodate the magical act first, and then later can function as poetry or become metrically regular. This idea of the speech act will carry through, and we'll compare that with the Jarðskinna spells. So magical charm number four is more commonly known as the with farasticha, or against a sharp pain or a sudden pain. And it serves as a good comparison with the Jarðskinna spells. So this charm provides a cure for elves' shot or witches' shot and describes various feminine adversaries attacking a patient with spears. Um, as noted by Batten, the charm begins repeating itself metrically. It maintains the same rhythm, echoing these attacks by the feminine adversaries. The use of anaphora with the repeated othe is a common rhetorical technique. That's something that we see in Alfrich and other kind of later Old English homilies and things like that to create a stronger effect. Um, the author of this charm also provides an exhaustive list of things to protect and things to protect against, another traditional motif. The repetition of the line that we'll see in a second, emphasizing fell, flash, blood, and lith, is also highly reminiscent of other spells, such as the Mersberg spells. If we scan the line, the scansion is provided by Batten, but um, works for us as well. Um, it reveals that the charm begins somewhat metrically regular. We see a repeated number of C verses if we scan them to sievers. But then it begins to devolve at the end. We've got one hypermetric line, a number of B verses, and then it starts to devolve into something that can't be scanned properly. We see several rule violations with expanded dips and generally unknown patterns, especially at the end. So overall, we can see that the formula takes precedence over metrical rules. We see the use of double alliteration as well. We see cross alliteration. This form repetition again, exhaustive protective lists. You can see that if we take it as a stanza, it begins with Yiftu wara an felshoten, again a number of othes with the anaphora, and then again Yifhit wara ese shot, and then again another of othes. So it's kind of structured this way, and then ends with this the, this the tubote. Um, so if we then move our focus over to magical rune sticks. We can see similar poetic techniques, especially in this Ribe healing stick. This also violates several metrical rules. We see double alliteration in the B verse, generally difficult scansion, some non-alliterating lines, expanded dips. In place of these, we see again the exhaustive list, i.e., citing Earth, High Heaven, Sun, Saint Mary, and God. We see emphasis on body parts in somewhat alliterating pairs. So we have Baki, Brosti, Lik, Lim, etc. Um, again, general repetition. And then we also have the reference to the speech act itself. So at the end, i.e., I've proclaimed in runic words. And somewhat the overall reliance on an incantatory rhythm rather than traditional quantitative metrics. The whole inscription begins with nearly metrical lines again, and then it begins to break towards the end. So we have um, sets of three alliterating words, then that devolves into alliterative pairs. At the beginning, we have some things that could be considered A verses or E verses, and then that also tends to break down. The inscription is also notable for its reference to nine needs, which is something seen in other Germanic terms, or sorry, other Germanic charms. We have the term Leitwissand, which also appears in the poem Sigdrifamal. So overall, we have that there are common poetic techniques seen in both the Scandinavian and the Old English folk magic, where the speech act itself must align with certain magical aesthetics, rather than traditional Old English meter. Um, these features are regular and expected, though, indicating a standard practice rather than being just idiosyncratic to any one charm. So if we then turn to the Jarðskinna, Kauri already kind of described these in terms of the folklorics. Um, so we see a related but diverging practice in terms of the metrics and how the charms read. So the first spell, which is listed as number 3 in the recent edition, is a conjuring spell. The spell begins by addressing an earth dweller, Jarðarbúi. Um, the object of the spell is to gain favors or words with the earth dweller while the conjurer sleeps. We can see parallels with native Icelandic or wider Scandinavian folk tales, where mound dwellers or even Droigar appear in dreams. The Kumulbuathautar is one famous example of this tradition. Um, but native Icelandic practice also describes individuals actively seeking advice or knowledge from Droigar or Elvar, as seen here. The conjuration and command of the spirit, though, is also continental, with ties to Solomon's Key and various occult practices to command spirits or devils. We heard that earlier with Roberto's talk, and George's as well. The author begins by describing the following spell or spells was used by previous generations, but does not explicitly use poetic terms to describe the spell. And this is something that we see in Galderbook, where um, the spells ask the agent to um, recite this verse, and the word that they use is kvida, and I think in most terms. So they're actually explicitly using a poetic term to refer to the spell. In the Yada book, it's not the Jarðskinna spells. They don't use this. Nonetheless, the conjuration spell does follow a loose alliterative pattern where the conjurer emphasizes certain commands, wishes, and imagery. Comparing the conjuring spell to the washing off trouble verse from the Galdr book also illustrates this common reliance on alliterative pairs rather than a traditional full line that we would expect in a normal poem. The conjuring spell frequently alliterates on verbs. It's emphasizing the spell's action and desired outcome. Although it broadly appears like alliterative verse, it's not. Traditional scansion reveals some A1, A3, and C verses, but overall there are no firm verse divisions or regularity. Traditional prosodic rules, such as restricting anacrusis, expanded dips, not alliterating on clitics, are not followed in the conjuring spell. The spell itself could be considered to be a poem without meter or alliterative prose, again, similar to what we see with Alfred's homilies and late Old English verse. The Conjuring spell does maintain an overall structure and pattern, though, which is broadly similar to that seen in Old English and especially the runic charms. The spells begin much like, there we go. The spell begins much like the Old English charms with alliterative, almost metrical clauses. This creates an incantatory rhythm. The rhythm then starts to break down, like some of the Old English charms, later as the conjurer ends the spell. The power builds and builds and builds and then dissipates. Um, Further, lines emphasizing the Earth Dweller are quickly followed by I or me statements. There's a constant link between the spirit and the conjurer. For instance, there's often the corresponding lines up statu with ég vil finn thig or latu mig sé thig. The spell also emphasizes the orientation of the spirit and the conjurer in space. Clauses frequently begin with prepositions or imperatives to get up. The spell repeatedly emphasizes up and down in relation to both agents, sometimes within the alliterative pairs, i.e., jeg and up. The conjurer begins by repeating up statu twice, and then on the third time, up stander. As the spirit stands, the immediate next line is the conjurer sleeping. The verbs are both in the active case, and the spell has worked. The spell also utilizes threes at the end. The verse ends with SSS, so we see alliteration and threes taken together. That's read as Svosem Segi, or may it be so as I say. Finally, the verse also ends with an exhaustive list, as that's seen in the Old English or runic charms. Specifically, the spell reads, I conjure you in and for the name of all creatures, and may this be. Although this is not so exhaustive, the conjurer still utilizes the name of all creatures to command the earth dweller. Overall, the spell exhibits many of the same techniques as the other cognate traditions, although with a separate purpose and a clear continental influence. As a kind of free prose or poem without meter, the spell is distinctly literary. It's the product of an author creating a spell. The correct formula or the quote unquote right words of the speech act, as described previously, have largely been divorced from the native poetic tradition. The second spell, the healing remedy spell, um, is included in the method for creating a healing remedy. After taking straw or grass um, to an area where spirits dwell and letting the dew collect in a vessel, the agent places the vessel on a mound and recites the following words while facing east. Again, as Kauri said earlier, there's a clear parallel to this that can be seen in Thorleif's Stouter Leorskalds. As with the washing off trouble verse and the conjuring spell, this healing spell also begins with the litter of pairs, although this is not maintained. We see a mixture of trochaic and dactylic stresses, um, though often with stress on what would be considered metrically unusual words. If scanned according to typical conventions, the spell also does not follow conventional rules of resolution or stress. The spell is most notable for its ending, where it utilizes cross alliteration for I Valfoders Nave och Vigfoders och Ausathors, or in the name of the slain father and the battle father and the god Thor. Here there's both cross alliteration and the use of threes, although Othin is referenced twice. Clearly, the cross-alliterating pairs of V and F are too poetically useful. The spell also begins or ends with repeating to you three times. Um, the spell follows a clear structure. The first and fourth line address nature. The second and fifth line connect the Huldufólk and healing. And then the third and sixth line both center on the agent commanding or using the remedy. The spell then moves into the invocation of pagan gods. Although the spell is shorter than the others, we can see the importance of form and technique rather than traditional poetic meter. The spell begins with short alliterating clause, proceeds to the desires of the agent, then invokes the outcome or the power with the use of threes, alliteration, or in this case, both. Although there's a reference to native folk practices, i.e., visiting mounds, Huldufólk, Odin, Thor, traditional magic technique is blended with the literate prose spells from the continent. As with the conjuring spell, the healing spell sacrifices traditional poetic meter for magic formulas and techniques. The third spell analyzed here has a small fragment that the agent should carve the spell on oak tablet and place it on the earth. It reads that the earth and all that is within is the Lord's. Then the agent carves a second verse, which reads, Let the wind stand on you under turf. The cross shall face towards the earth. The blood ring of the mouse here in the middle. You can see that on the recto side there. The spell is notable for a few reasons. First, there's a clear trochaic nature to the carving. But as with the other spells discussed here, it fails to scan properly according to traditional metrical rules. Although if one allows for resolution on the inni, the line approaches something more noticeably verse. Second, as with the other spells, there's alliance on the exhaustive list motif by referencing Alta Tathar er inni and citing the authority of a supernatural power, in this case, the Christian God. The next verse, carving, likewise follows a poetic structure, um, repeating prepositions to cover all the aspects around the agent, up, down, to the sides. Um, and then the blood ring also mimics the verse. So the circle rings around all the aspects stated in the spell. The carving then becomes the speech act. Although quite short, the spell follows a similar magical formula to those seen earlier. Third and perhaps most speculative, though, is the actual paleographic structure. The two carvings are structured deliberately on the page. In the first, all the capital letters or words alliterate vocalically. Jöðin alt inni. The first two letters of Drottens are actually split, showing that O, which would then alliterate vocalically. The author scribe deliberately writes and ini in all capitals. The second carving is likewise broken into four quadrants. Again, you can see that on the recto side. Um, Further speculation would be, branching into this fantastic, but it does seem that there's an underlying logic or choice being made. There's a deliberate relationship between the spell's words and how they're structured on the carving or on the page. Traditional metrics in poetic form has been replaced by spell order and function. One could speak of paleographic metrics or metrics on the page, as it were. The physical words are structured on the page rather than traditional poetic form. An analogous tradition can be seen in the magical word squares in the occult tradition, um, like in the Key of Solomon, where uh, these magical word squares, where numbers and letters are formed in deliberate ways for a magical purpose, usually for an invocation. So overall, the three spells here analyzed similar motifs and formulas to those in the analogous traditions, such as the Old English charms and the rune sticks. The traditions are clearly based on oral traditions, utilizing poetic meter or at least adapting metrical norms, while the spells in the Jarðskinna manuscript, as well as those seen in the Galdrabók, are far more literary in origin. In other words, the spells are created for and by individual authors, drawing from both native Scandinavian tradition and continental occult practice. The spells are largely divorced from oral tradition in favor of spell function. Again, drawing from Jonathan Roper, the spells must function as a magical speech act first and foremost, and then these functions are no longer attached to oral formulae, although certain important motifs remain constant throughout. Um, we can see in the Galder book that there are a number of hands, so there's trading of books, and this attests to how these spells may have been traded, adapted, moved across space and time, and each time the author is looking back to the past and trying to create their own spell. Um, Future work should consider how the spells in the Icelandic grimoires physically place the words on the page, not just the sigils, and how these structures function in a magical context. The physical structure, the metrics on the page, may form an underlying logic to the magical act. Additionally, this analysis has largely focused on traditional four-position metrics, and not looked at extra metrical lines or syllable counting meters. Recent work by Batten, Hartman, and Bredehoft have yielded interesting results by looking at extrametrical lines in Old English poetry. Um, and as an aside, I'm currently starting a project to analyze the syntax and poetic techniques of galdralag, like constructions in Old Norse charms, and whether they are utilized in similar ways to hypermetric verses in Old English, specifically the Old English charms. So while these spells in the Jarðskinna do not follow traditional poetic meter, certain motifs and techniques clearly form a foundation that is shared across the magical north. Thank you.